Hello, everybody. This is Sam Langstein here. We're switching over from the Refuat Hanefesh Facebook page to have a live conversation about suicidality and mental illness in the Jewish community. Um, Give me a minute as we kind of tie up a couple of those technical pieces. And I'm adding the executive director of Refuat Hanefesh right now.
Hi, I apologize for all the technical difficulties. Welcome to the 7th Refuat HaNefesh live conversation. My name is Dr. Ariel Mintz, and I am the Executive Director of Refuat HaNefesh. Refuat HaNefesh is an organization dedicated to eradicating the mental health stigma in the Jewish community through education and discussion, and providing support to people affected by mental illness through our online support community. In order for us to be successful in our mission, we need all of you to join forces with us. And so if you like this live conversation and what we are attempting to do, please follow our social media pages, read our informative articles on refuathanefesh.org, enter the creative contest to help improve our community's response to mental health and at the same time win some cool prizes, and subscribe to our mailing list. Before we get started with this, I would like to thank our sponsors for this event. Keith and Alana Moskowitz have graciously sponsored this event in order to show their appreciation for the work Refuat HaNefesh has done and will continue to do in helping people better understand and appreciate the impact of mental illness in our community. If you are interested in sponsoring future live conversations or other events, or have ideas about how we could accomplish our mission, please contact us through Facebook or through the website at refuathanefesh.org or by emailing info@refuathanefesh.com. Tonight, we are privileged to have Sam Langstein join us for an honest and meaningful conversation about suicidal ideation, how it impacted his life, and what he would like to impart to every individual who may know someone who's connected to someone with suicidal ideations, and how they could help that person. Sam Langstein grew up in Woodmere, New York. He began experiencing suicidal thoughts as early as the age of 8 years. By 17, he frequently abused substances, self-harmed, and was eventually hospitalized a number of times. Now in his 20s, Sam is working to battle the stigmas associated with mental illness and advocate for mental health reform in the Jewish community. Before we get started, I'd like to just explain how this will work. So for the first half of this event, it will be a conversation between me and Sam. And then for the second half, the viewers are welcome to ask their questions, and we'll do our best to get to as many as possible. If you have questions, you can post them in the Facebook comments, or if you'd like to remain anonymous, you could send them to info@refuathanefesh.org, refuathanefesh.org. We'll now begin the conversation with Sam. Sam, thank you so much for joining us today.
Of course. Happy to be here.
Why don't we start by you telling us why you decided to share your story with Refuat HaNefesh?
Sure. So as you mentioned, I experienced suicidal thoughts and ideation for a big chunk of my life, and I think that my story, in a lot of ways, goes untold and the story of people with mental illness goes untold in the Jewish community. And I think a big part of bettering the lives of those with mental illness is to speak up, share stories, and start to work on stomping out the stigma and to work on trying to create productive change in the communities that we're a part of. So I think speaking to Refuat HaNefesh and sharing my story in any way that I can, I'm just happy to do it.
Well, thank you for being part of that and helping to reduce the stigma and open up about all this. Can you tell us more about your individual story?
Sure. So I experienced kind of suicidal thoughts and depression from as early as 8 years old. The clearest distinct memory I have is when I was on my 8th birthday looking out the front door of my house and just thinking, I don't want to be here. I didn't have, the words to fully express why I was feeling that way. I didn't even know why I was feeling that way. Um, but, uh, but it was there. And kind of over the course of the next few years, things stayed in relatively that level of suicidality, that level of depression. Frequently, I would go to the school nurse and say, "I don't feel well," and she would say, "Point to where it hurts," and I wouldn't be able to point to where it hurt because it was a feeling that I didn't have words for. And things kind of progressed in that level, depression, until I was about 15 or 16. Things got much worse. When I was 15 or 16, I started having much more active thoughts of suicide and started thinking about ways to commit suicide, which is a huge piece of suicidality. And so when I was 16, I started having these plans and started having these thoughts. And thankfully, I didn't act on them, or when I did start acting on them, I never, fully went through with the plans. And then at the age of about 17, as the thoughts were intensifying even more, I met a new group of friends. Where I was once originally very socially isolated, I started to kind of branch out in my social network and fell in with this group of friends who, these peers who got me in a lot of ways. They, also struggled with mental illness. There were a lot of people with eating disorders. There were a lot of people who, were on the margins in any number of ways. And while that peer group in a lot of ways was very good for me, they also introduced me to drugs and alcohol. And so by the age of 17, I started more consistently abusing alcohol and opiates, pot, any number of drugs that I could get my hands on. And then I eventually got sober. But my story kind of kept going from there, because while I became sober with the help of my brother, Ben, who had an intervention with me, and my family, who, sent me to outpatient rehab right before I graduated high school. So while there was a lot of good things happening and I was able to overcome the addiction and start getting sober, I really struggled with mental illness for, much longer, and kept struggling. And after graduating high school, after being sober for only a couple of months, I went to Israel after high school, as is pretty common. And there I just, the depression got worse. I was taken out of my support system that I knew. And within a couple of weeks of being in Israel, found myself on the walls of the old city about to jump. And I had this moment of hesitation, got off the wall, called my brother, who was also studying in the old city, and together we kind of came up with a plan, speaking to a rabbi he knew in Israel who knew of a psychiatric hospital. And that night I was taken to a psychiatric hospital where I stayed for a couple of days and was ultimately transferred to a facility in New York in America. And I spent about a month there. And really, that was a place of healing for me. And being in inpatient treatment helped me so much, and was really reorienting in how I changed my life. So from there, I went to college. I went to Hunter College and studied psychology. And yeah, now I'm almost 7 years sober, and happy to be alive.
Wow, that's all quite remarkable. Several questions come up when I hear that story. One I want to ask, because you were in a very scary situation, and you went ahead and you called 911. You actually were admitted to a psychiatric hospital. That's something many people are afraid to do because of the repercussions of that. I'm curious, after you went to the hospital, how did your school react to that? The yeshiva you were in Israel, what was their reaction?
I'm sorry, you're breaking up a bit. Could you just repeat the question one more time? I heard all the preface stuff, but the question slipped through me.
Sure. When you were admitted to the hospital, how did you being admitted, and then were you welcomed back afterwards, or were they worried about their liability?
I'm sorry, Ariel. There's a lot of feedback.
Okay. Let me try turning this down. After you were admitted to the hospital, what was the reaction of your rabbis in the school where you were at in Israel?
Sure. So the school I was at in Israel, while I was there, I was very depressed. I wouldn't get up, for morning shiur. I don't think once for the 2-3 weeks I was there. Um, and after a little while, I ended up speaking to one of the rabbis there about what I was feeling, about how I was recently sober. But in a lot of ways, they didn't know everything that was going on. There was a kind of a lack of communication between a lot of my support systems because there's stigma around mental illness because, I didn't want, the rabbis knowing, and then the rabbis, I was a bit worried. Would they be able to keep it private? Would they be able to handle the things that I was bringing up? So they didn't really know much about, me being hospitalized until I was already hospitalized. And then once I got out of the hospital in Israel, it seemed pretty clear that, I was in another hospital for a month, that I shouldn't be coming back to yeshiva.
That you should not, you said.
Yeah, that I should not come back to yeshiva in Israel. That's the way I understood it. And again, I think that was the right move for me because, again, going to college, being in America where my parents were, where most of my family was, that was definitely the right move for me.
Okay. Now, I imagine right now there's many parents and educators that are watching you speak, and they may be worried about their own children or students. What can you tell us about some of the earliest signs that you exhibited, and at what point it might be appropriate if people see these signs for them to start to worry and maybe try to intervene to help them?
Yeah, definitely. So I mentioned going to the school nurse when I was, as early as 10, 11 years old and saying that I don't feel well and that I feel like I need to go home. And that's, I think, one of the big signs, particularly in very young children, because they don't have the language so often to explain, I'm depressed, my brain is doing this thing to me. The way I would express it is saying, my head hurts, my stomach hurts. But I think even the signs that I displayed after that, really probably the most intense period of my life in terms of illness, addiction, all these things was my last year of high school, and I was showing tons of signs. I mean, my senior year, I missed, I think it was 45 days of school. So missing school was a huge sign. I started hanging out with this other group of friends that wasn't my typical group of friends. I was often, high and drunk while I was, around these people. So there were a lot of signs like that were being displayed that definitely a lot of people could have picked up on.
Okay. And so then what would you have wished that they would have done for you? Could they have altered your path in any way?
Yeah, definitely. So I think so my school had a social worker. I only spoke to the social worker once. Another peer had this long conversation between me and him, trying to introduce us. The social worker, I think, had trouble in explaining to me and in connecting me to other resources. But I think the biggest piece of intervention that could have been done is for people to be very upfront and honest about that there are treatment options available, that there are things that can be done, and to work on connecting me with those, with therapy outside, with peer support groups, with Alcoholics Anonymous or Narcotics Anonymous. And there's a lot to help me find professional help is really the most important piece, because there are professionals who are trained in handling these situations, and they're available, and it's just a matter of connecting to them.
Do you think you would have been open to that initially if, when you were still in high school, if someone suggested that you get some treatment for drug use or that you see a counselor, would you have been open to that?
So I think, and again, I think this is the part where early intervention is really important. So in kind of the throes of my addiction, I certainly would have been much more hesitant. But earlier intervention, while I was still depressed, while I was contemplating suicide, while I was planning suicide, before even the drug use, I was really in a lot of ways like so desperate for help, and 100% I would have, tried to get help.
So you would have taken their advice and you would have gone for the help. Okay, I think that's an important point.
Yeah.
Okay. Going back, so you mentioned that in Israel you were on a psychiatric unit, and I think you have mentioned to me in the past that there were other times as well that you were admitted to inpatient psychiatric wards. Most people watching this, or most people in the general public, they've never been on a psychiatric inpatient unit, and their impression of it may be something that they've seen in movies where they see people that are severely disturbed and kind of zombie-like creatures that are aimlessly walking around. Maybe you could describe for people watching what a psychiatric ward is like.
Sure. So I've been to a few different facilities. I'll say that the one that I was at in Israel was really not a particularly good one, and it very much was the exception to the rule of what psychiatric hospitals are like. The one I was at in America was on an old campground, like an old summer camp. So there was all these little cottages that we were in. There was a number of social workers who were very caring, who were very empathetic, who really wanted me to get better, who were really trained in making me better. So I think the psychiatric hospitals really get a bad reputation, but really are not like what you see in the movies, are not like these scary places where they chain you up or any of these horrible things that maybe they used to do in the past. There's certainly still a lot of room for growth with our mental health system in America. But if someone needs to go to a psychiatric hospital, the thing that it shouldn't stop them to think that it's going to be a scary place or a place where you aren't treated well.
Okay. Thank you for sharing that experience. So, you've shared with us, really a remarkable journey that you've been through. You really appear to be doing well. I think you mentioned that you've been sober now for 7 years. Do you feel that you're cured of your addiction and mental illness? Or do you feel that there's still days that are difficult and you're still fighting a battle with it?
Yeah, I'm still fighting a battle. I think one of the most difficult pieces, one of the most difficult things to come to terms with is that my mental illness is very likely to be a part of the rest of my life. I was hospitalized just a little over a year ago last. I still struggle with depression often. I still have thoughts of suicide, and so I'm not over it. I'm not cured, but I'm in consistent treatment. I see a psychiatrist once a week. I go to support groups outside of that, and I have a pretty robust support system in my own life, of family and friends, and so I think while it is still something that I struggle with, I've gotten better equipped at battling it.
Okay. So, this is the kind of big question I'm thinking right now when I talk to you. Many people have mental illness. In fact, I believe the estimates are about 40% of people will be diagnosed with a mental illness in their lifetime. Most people are not public about it at all. There's obviously a big stigma. People have a lot of shame with it. People don't talk about it. You, though, not only are you public about it, you've become a big advocate for trying to reduce this stigma. What made you decide to open up about it and let everyone into your world and start trying to break down this stigma and helping other people that are out there going through the same things?
I'm sorry, Ariel, there's a bit of feedback again.
What made you decide to be so public about your experience and share it with the world and not be afraid to open up about it? I'm gonna go get some headphones and I will be right back.
I'm sorry. Could you repeat that one more time? Facebook Live is giving us some difficulties again.
Yeah, I apologize for the feedback. I'm gonna get some headphones. But what I wanted to ask you is what led to you becoming an advocate for mental health and opening up about your story?
What led me to be an advocate? Yeah, so sorry, I'm just seeing your comment here on the Facebook video. You asked what led me to be an advocate. Um, that's a great question. I think for me, um, I feel like I'm in a place in my life where I have a level of stability. I'm doing well in a lot of ways, and I feel like I can be open about my journey and about my own mental health history. And also, I think just seeing such a need for it. I mean, right now, the Orthodox community is in the middle of a huge, we're being affected by the opioid epidemic in such a huge way, hundreds of lives being taken from us. And I think that's really waken me up to the fact that there are people who've experienced this, who've come out on the other side, who need to be who, if they're in the position to be, should be open about their experiences and about treatment options being available. And I try to be a role model of what could be possible. I don't know how well I'm doing, but I try to be a role model about of living with mental illness and doing well.
Hi, Sam, can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you better now.
Okay. I apologize for those difficulties with hearing before. I hope it's fixed now. You mentioned earlier that you found yourself while in Israel, kind of on the walls of the old city, thinking about jumping off. As a country, something we struggle with a lot are a debate over gun control. In terms of the risk of homicide. However, about twice as many people each year die from suicide by guns as they do by homicide. And we've learned that one of the most effective means of reducing suicide is means restriction. For instance, the Golden State Bridge, when they put up nets, suicides fell remarkably. What advice would you give to parents who may be concerned about their own children being at risk, or just general parents? What advice would you give them about how to make their home safer or reduce the risk that their children might be able to harm themselves?
So there's a little bit of feedback, but I hear the question is, what advice would I give to parents to make their home safer? So yeah, I think there are a lot of pretty quick answers to that even. I mean, study after study shows that access to lethal means and access to ways of taking one's own life are, the greater the access, the much more likely it is. And you mentioned the Golden Gate Bridge. If bridges that have safety barriers under them, they're just, people in those areas will take their own lives less. So in people's own houses, I think throwing away or locking away old prescription painkillers and opiate medications, painkillers, is huge. I mean, yeah, for me, that was a very easy way of getting drugs. I think locking liquor cabinets, especially right now, we're right before Purim, another huge way of reducing the risk. Was there anything you wanted to add to that, Ariel? If there was anything.
I think you actually went where I was hoping you would go. So thank you. I'd like to ask you, what's your vision for 20 years from now? How will the community treat a 16-year-old going through what you went through? And what can we as a community do to lessen the pain and suffering?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
I was asking, what is your vision for 20 years from now? How do you envision we could treat a 16-year-old differently than the way you were treated? Or, what can we do differently as a community to lessen the pain of people that are suffering, allow them to open up and get the help that they need?
Yeah. I think there's so much we can do. I think, again, stigma is a huge piece. Stigma is, study after study shows that it's one of the greatest barriers to individuals getting treatment. But I think even community-wide, there are a lot of things we can do. I think really schools are one of the most important pieces of the puzzle around mental illness and addiction, particularly in the Orthodox community. I mean, I was in school often from 8 a.m. till 6 p.m., often 8 or 9 p.m. So when I'm in school that much, that's really where a lot of the signs I was displaying were. That's really where a lot of the learning that I was doing and could have been doing would take place. So I think training rabbis to be able, and teachers to be able to spot the signs, getting social workers in school who are qualified and knowledgeable, and that may mean more than one. And there's a huge quite frankly, it's a funding issue. I know a lot of schools that are hesitant to increase this department because they feel like they want to increase the funding in other departments. But I think bringing people on, adopting curriculums for schools, all these things that schools could be doing. I think in 20 years, that's where I'd like to see the Jewish community. Having curriculums, having rabbis who know, and having the stigma be less severe.
What do you think will drive the community to realize the importance of it? Is it going to have to be the suicide of several prominent people in the community? Or is there a better way that we could come to terms with that before there's tragedies?
I certainly hope it's not going to be that. And I also don't believe that, the statistics that we've seen in the Orthodox community with people like Tzvi Gluck from Amudim, who's been tracking some of these numbers, this really does feel like the moment where the Orthodox community we have to get our act together. And so I hope it's not the suicide of prominent figures. I hope it's not, more and more lives that we're losing. But yeah, at this point, I think it's hard to say what'll do it. I think one thing I've seen is as people get more and more vocal about it, as parents call schools, as former students call their old school. If you're an alum, call your old school and say, what are you doing to make sure that students don't slip through the cracks? And kind of putting pressure on schools to get their act together, and putting pressure on shuls to get their act together. I think these are all really important steps.
Wow, I think that's fantastic advice. Oftentimes, we get frustrated by an issue and we wish things would change. But, maybe we have to be the voice to encourage the change and really push for it. And I think that's great advice that you just gave. Sam, I really appreciate you sharing this story with us. I'd like to open it up now for questions from our viewers. Again, people could either post comments on the Facebook page, or if they'd like to remain anonymous, they could send their questions and comments to info@refuathanefesh.org, and we will try to get to as many as we can. The first one that's popping up on the screen right now is from Eitan Neiman. It says, Sam, you're an inspiration that anybody should strive for. The world could use more people like you. Have you done other mental health advocacy work, and do you have further plans?
Have I done other mental health advocacy work, and do I have further plans? Thank you for those words, Eitan. It really means a lot. Other mental health advocacy work. I think sharing my own story. I worked with the Jewish Week on this with a writer, Hannah Dreyfus, on a 3-part series that came out in October. That feels like one of the biggest pieces. I also work at an organization called Footsteps, which helps people who are looking to leave the ultra-Orthodox world, or people who have already left. And while it's certainly not a mental health organization, there are pieces of that, of mental illness that come into my work there. And in the future, I'd love to pursue graduate school at some point, and kind of figure out what path I can take to be better equipped to even answer questions that people may be asking.
Okay, thank you, Sam. So we had an anonymous question sent in as well as one that's a little similar here, so I'll combine them. Someone says, both my children have been in psych hospitals for suicide attempts when they were teens. Both have had lots of therapies. How can I help them when they're resistant to further treatment and to getting the increased help that they do need?
Yeah, I'm really sorry to hear that, to whoever just submitted that question. I think, it's really tough and it's really discouraging for someone you love to kind of be going through this and to be resistant to treatment and be resistant to all the ways that you're trying to help. But as difficult as it is, I think it's so important to kind of, and again, this may seem a little cliche, but to keep up the support that you're giving, because it is crucial. It is really important. And there only is so much that an individual, even a very loving parent, can do for someone who's struggling with this. So just, if you're listening to this, if it sounds like you've found them treatment, it sounds like you're doing a lot of things right, and just keep doing them, and hopefully, treatment will catch up and will start working at some point. Ariel, I know you're a psychiatrist by training, so if you have anything to add to that question particularly, I'd be curious about your input.
Sure, and I think that's a tough question. I think you answered it quite nicely. It's really, the person has to come to the realization that they're not in a good state at that point, and they have to want help. And all you could do as a parent or as someone who supports them is be that constant sense of love and support, and let them know that you're there for them when they need the help, and constantly, gently suggest that they go see someone else, get further treatment. But they need you in their life. Sometimes you do have to show tough love, but as frustrating as for you, be their solid rock that's there to support them in their times of struggling, because they are struggling. Sam, we had another anonymous question asking, for someone who's currently suffering from suicidal ideation and addiction, what advice can you give to help them along their road?
That's a great question. So I think it sounds like you're in a really tough place, to whoever asked that question. And it's really hard to believe, but the main message that I have is that it gets better, which it does. I mentioned recently I was hospitalized, just a little over a year ago. I still struggle with all these things. But if I think back to the times when, I was struggling with addiction, particularly when I was struggling with addiction, but even through my teen years, it was so difficult. And it didn't seem like things were going to get better. And suicidality is so connected to a loss of hope, to hopelessness. And, kind of finding the things in your life that do bring you some sense of hope are the things that you need to really pursue and reach out for. Because anything you can do to hold on to hope that things will get better is important. And ultimately, I believe they will. I hope they will.
Okay. Have you found support groups to be helpful, or have you found just meeting one-on-one with a therapist to be most helpful? What for you has kind of been the thing that's helped the most?
Yeah, thank you. Certainly, yes, thank you. I completely forgot to mention, and also to whoever asked that question, of course, finding treatment, finding professional help is incredibly important. I think for me, again, some of the most influential pieces of me getting better have been the treatment that I've received. Being a part of, I'm in a psychiatric clinic right now. The support groups that I've attended throughout my life. And so finding a support system, whether it's through support groups, family, friends, whoever does get it, that's really important. And also treatment, one-on-one therapies, psychotherapy, psychiatric drugs, which again, I've been on for a number of years, all really important pieces of the puzzle. And, in addition to hope, is, a very practical piece of advice that I would definitely encourage you to go to.
Okay. We got another anonymous question They're curious about if you believe your substance use had a greater impact on your suicidal ideation, or the suicidal ideation had a greater impact on you starting to use substances.
Interesting. It's a bit chicken and the egg there. What came first? I think both of them just made each other worse. It's hard to say which one was worse. One thing I didn't fully mention was, when I was 17 on Purim, the night of Purim, I made a suicide attempt on my own life while I was drinking very heavily. I ended up going to the emergency room that night because I was drinking so heavily. And it was only once I was already drinking, once I was already kind of my judgment was poor, and as my judgment got worse and worse, I was more and more likely to make an attempt. So it's hard to say which one was worse. It certainly feels like each one made the other worse, though.
Okay. We had another question just come in on Facebook, and you did to a degree address this earlier, but they want to know, are there external signs that one should look out for in family, friends that may point to the direction that they need help? And to add some nuance to this, so you had mentioned early on you were having, a lot of vague pain symptoms, but,
Yeah, so I think No, you keep going, sorry.
No, take the question.
Sure. So I'll let Ariel finish, but again, just to mention that, particularly in early childhood, before I was able to vocalize it, these kind of vague pain symptoms that I was having were one of the signs that I was being very vocal about. But also, I was, again, throughout a lot of the depressive periods of my life, I was sleeping late. I was having trouble focusing. My grades slipped when I was starting to enter depressive periods. And again, ultimately, another symptom of particularly the drug use was hanging out with a new group of friends. And so these are things that you can kind of stay attuned to in the people you care about whether they might be showing signs of a mental illness, particularly depression. Ariel, did you want to add?
Okay. No, I think that's great. I think what we advise people in the psychiatry field is, when we're talking about teenagers, any change that you see from their baseline, whether it's not going to school, whether it's getting worse grades, whether it's getting new friends, just acting differently, that's a big red flag. And that's something that you should start to worry about and try to get into their internal world and find out what's going on, because that could be a sign that things are wrong. It could be the onset of a mental illness. It could be drug use. It could be bullying in school. And bullying itself, could obviously lead to a lot of these issues as well. It increases the risk of drug use and it increases the risk of mental illness. But there's something going on likely. And so speak to your children. They, especially teenagers that might not answer you. Feel free to go to the teachers. Speak to other people that see them more commonly, and see what they might be thinking. Okay. We had a question that similar to one was asked earlier, but they asked, what advice do you have for a teenager who has depressing or suicidal thoughts, low self-esteem?
Again, I think this goes a bit back to the question from the person who asked, maybe from their own perspective. I think, again, seeking out treatment, speaking to an adult in your life who you trust about the feelings and thoughts that you have. Adults, they don't hold all the answers, but they certainly hold a lot of the cards when it comes to treatment. So reaching out to your support network, even speaking to peers, while certainly not as good as speaking to adults in a lot of ways, peers were an incredibly valuable piece of my own journey of getting better. So for a teen who's suffering from depression, suffering from low self-esteem, I think, just finding treatment is one of the most important pieces.
Okay. Another anonymous question that came in is, they say, Sam, can you talk more about how you felt like you fell through the cracks at school?
Mm. It's a good question. So I think, one thing I've mentioned maybe in other places, not necessarily just on this chat, but I feel like I in a lot of ways, I fell through the cracks at the high school I went to. I think a lot of it comes back to me showing so many of these symptoms, but it was never fully addressed. And I know from, a lot of different people that I've spoken to who've gone to similar schools, who, in whatever school they go to, is that there are people, kind of the squeaky wheel gets the grease, maybe. Is that the phrase? That people who are louder, who it's more well known, those are the people who get a bit more attention. And, in school, I was a quiet, introverted kid. And so I didn't get as much attention. And even when I started showing signs and when I started reaching out for help in whatever ways, I mentioned very briefly, there was a short period of time when I was trying to speak to the social worker about these issues. And, I felt like that really didn't go well. And all my symptoms got much worse even afterwards. I remember, and then again, just another pretty clear example in my mind. I remember once speaking to one of my rabbis in, I think it was my junior year, whatever, 11th grade, about, I think I asked him the question, why should I be living? And we were learning Gemara, it was maybe a Mishmar or something, and I asked him this more philosophical question of why should I be living? And I kind of kept pressing him on it as I was speaking to him about all these more philosophical things. But it was very clear to me that, this wasn't just a philosophical question. I was telling him, I don't want to be here, and why should I keep living? And, he brought me to Ramchal and all these, inside sources saying, well, the reason why people should live is this. And he was a very well-meaning, very well-intentioned person who just wasn't able to pick up on what was underlying the questions that I was asking. And so that is, I think, a good example of a way that I slipped through the cracks, and there's so many more.
That's I think that goes back to your original point, your earlier point, that schools need more training. They need more people in the school that could address this. Because you're a rabbi, he was a rabbi, he was addressing, Judaism, and he didn't see the signs when it was right in front of his face. Maybe with more training, he could have picked up on that and gotten you help sooner. I'd like to remind people that if they have anonymous questions, they could send them to info@refuahanefesh.org. And you could also write comments in the Facebook chat to get your questions answered as well. Another question we have here is, do you think a lot of people were surprised when you came out about your struggle?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that question, Ariel?
An anonymous person asked, do you think a lot of people were surprised when you came out about your struggle?
I think some people were and some people weren't. That's kind of a lame answer, but a lot of people who've been a part of my life for the past 7 years know that I don't drink, know that I don't use drugs, and so maybe me coming out is something that about my struggles with addiction, or something that made sense. But I think a lot of, in hearing secondhand from the school I went to, a lot of people there were very surprised because, they saw it as Sam wasn't one of the troubled kids. I think that was maybe the way that they thought of it. So I think some people who maybe were a bit more on the periphery of my life were very surprised. But it's a big part of me, a big part of my identity is, my own personal history and journey. So I think a lot of people close to me, or even closer to me, knew that there was something there.
We have a question asking you, how has or has not religion and spirituality been a part of your recovery?